Hey everybody, it's the Grumpy Meatball. Welcome back to the second installment of my series called Marvel United X-Men Who Dis, where I dive into the characters unlocked in the stretch goals for the campaign and explain exactly who the hell this person is and what their powers are and go into a little more detail on the background of the character, etc. So this week we are featuring Polaris. This was the second character unlocked. Real name Lorna Dane. And as usual, I'm going to start by reading the description that Simon has, and then we'll go a little deeper. So, the illegitimate daughter of Magneto, Lorna Dane possesses many of Magneto's strong powers. She fought to unite mutants and humans with the X-Men as Polaris. Unfortunately, she was often mentally afflicted by her powers. At one point, she developed a mutation that made her enraged, and those around her experienced it within themselves. Despite these setbacks, she continued to fight for good and joined X Factor as a leader. Okay, so in terms of the gameplay here, it talks about how using her magnetic manipulation, she can spread her attacks over multiple locations at the same time, and that she's also able to create powerful magnetic fields that protect her against any damage, basically. So, very cool. And then here's her game piece, her miniature. Looks great. The hair looks really great. Lots of texture there. So going a little deeper, pull up my handy dandy. I made this in Microsoft Paint. Kind of a little document here. So Lorna Dane Polaris is a very old character in the X universe. She showed up in the 49th issue of X-Men. So, decades of history with the team. And she's mostly known, particularly in the modern day, basically, for being a member of a team called X Factor. So X Factor was interesting because there are at least two teams that were called X Factor throughout the kind of late 80s, early 90s. There were the original X-Men, so Cyclops, Jean Grey, Beast, Iceman, and Archangel, or yeah, who Angel, who left the X-Men basically, I think partially because they had maybe outgrown it, and also because at the time Magneto had taken over as the headmaster of the Xavier Institute, and they had clashed with Magneto enough times that they just didn't feel comfortable with kind of living under his leadership. And so they formed a team called X Factor, which was basically kind of helping mutants under the guise of hunting them. And that incarnation of X Factor lasted until basically the new X-Men relaunch happened in I think 1991. And that's when characters, all those kind of core characters, came back to the X books when they split the teams up into the gold and blue teams. And a new X Factor team was basically immediately formed that was basically a government agency populated by mutants. And the kind of premier members of the team, or the initial team makeup was, you had Madrox, the multiple man. So we'll be talking about a lot of these characters as we go on, because almost all of them show up in this campaign. I think all of them do, actually. You had the multiple man, you had Polaris, Wolf's Bane, Havoc, Quicksilver, and then not pictured here is the character Strong Guy, who we're going to talk about next week, actually. And so this is, Polaris was always kind of in and out of the books, but I think that this is where the first time she really had like a starring long-term role, where she was a founding member of X Factor. So early on, like in her first appearance way back in, the 60s, basically, because of the similarity in their power sets, there was an implication from the get-go that there was a familial kind of relationship between Polaris and Magneto. And it was kind of like a long-running like mystery / question that only very recently got fully kind of explained, or truly explained. And so there was this kind of back and forth: is she the daughter of Magneto or not? And it turns out that yes, in fact, she is, and that she was the result of an affair, basically, between Magneto and her mother. And it's kind of a sad story, but so her powers manifested really early in her life, during a fight in which her mother and father were fighting about the fact that she had this affair. And she basically unleashed, kind of like a magnetic pulse that, unfortunately, resulted in the death of her parents, because they were on an airplane at the time and it crashed. And so there was always this question of her parentage and her relationship to Magneto, and like I said, very, very recently in the comic book kind of lore, it's been finally revealed that yes, he is her father, that he actually encountered her after the accident that killed her parents, and basically had mastermind kind of mind wiper, or create a long-term illusion for her so that she could kind of grow up with a sense of normalcy, and kind of reset her memories to some extent. And so kind of one of the key aspects of the character is the father-daughter relationship that she has with Magneto. And I don't know why I can't zoom in on this, but let me see if I can, because it's a good... Yeah, here we go. So here she's having a discussion with Magneto where they're basically talking about what a shitty dad he's been. And she says, dads and daughters, you think any of them ever really get it right? And Magneto says, I can't imagine that any of them ever do. And then she just says, yeah, you weren't really cut out for parenting. You kind of suck at it. Which is fair criticism. And, there's been a lot of changes to Magneto's kind of family relationships in the last 20 years of the books or so, because, famously, he was always portrayed as the father of Quicksilver and the Scarlet Witch. And that's actually been debunked. And in fact, in the current incarnation of, the characters, I don't believe that they're even mutants anymore. Some of that is weird power jockeying stuff between Marvel and Fox, because of the X-Men license and whatnot, and maybe that kind of doesn't really make sense in universe. But the bottom line is that, as far as I know, Polaris is actually the only real offspring Magneto, the only real child Magneto's ever had, because Quicksilver and the Scarlet Witch don't number among that group anymore. So that's a key aspect of her character, is her kind of the Magneto connection. Another key aspect is her relationship with the X-Man / X-Factor leader, Havoc. They have a long running kind of will they, won't they, did they, oh, they almost got married, but they ended up breaking it off, and he had a psychic affair with his nurse, but he still loved Lorna, and so very kind of a lot of drama in the relationship here. But these two have been kind of intrinsically tied together for decades in the books. And here we have a scene where, and if you don't know, we're going to get into Havoc later in the series, but he's one of the Summers brothers, so the brother of Cyclops and of Vulcan, and a very powerful mutant and leader of X Factor, was a kind of key member of the X-Men in the late 80s. Like I said, when characters like Cyclops had left the team, and moved on, Havoc was among the mutants who remained on the team. Havoc, Storm, and Colossus, and Dazzler, Longshot, so this relationship between the two is another kind of key element of the character, and you can see that it's also factors into what I would consider to be kind of the third key element of the character, and that's the mental instability that Simon kind of hinted at in the character bio. So the idea is that Polaris, she's basically bipolar. Here's a scene where Havoc is talking about her, and he says, so Lorna's going to run I believe they're talking about X Factor here. Lorna's going to run X Factor? You sure about that? The character off screen says, quite sure. And he just says, do they know she's nuts? Pretty brutal. Pretty brutal call out. But the character has had kind of a troubled mental history. She's been possessed for long periods of time. This a character named Malice was kind of masterminded by Mr. Sinister to take over her body, basically, and control her and turn her into a villain, essentially. So she had the kind of trauma from that. She was also present at the Genosian massacre when, at the time, Magneto was basically ruling the island nation of Genosha, and it had become a mutant, island, essentially, kind of similar to Krakoa. Krakoa is not the first time that they've leaned into this idea of mutants going and creating their own society. Genosha had traditionally been kind of a dark place in the X universe for mutants because it was run by a kind of anti-mutant, kind of government that enslaved mutants and was actively persecuting them. And once it was liberated, Magneto started a new society, basically, on Genosha. And for a time, Polaris joined him so that she could train with him in the use of her mutant abilities, because, again, they're virtually identical to Magneto's. And that meant that she was there when the mutants, the Super Sentinels, wiped Genosha off the face of the earth basically and murdered 16 million mutants. So she was deeply traumatized by that event. And you can see here in a panel from from the current run of books from the X of Swords series, you can see here her talking about her kind of instability and talking about her self-hatred and her need for validation and so forth. And so this idea that she's a little damaged, by the things that she's been through, is another key element of the character. In terms of where you can read more about Polaris, you can go back and read X Factor. So they didn't actually, when the original team left the book, they didn't actually relaunch the book. They just kept on rolling basically, and they just replaced them with the second generation team, and that team debuted in X Factor Volume 1, number 71. And so she was on the team basically through the whole rest of the run of X Factor. And like I said, you can also see her play a pretty pivotal role early on, at least, in the current X of Swords kind of crossover event that happened very recently. And I haven't even finished reading X of Swords yet. But she basically serves the role of kind of like the messenger for the X team to understand the rules of this kind of duel that they're undertaking with a group from another kind of nation or world called Araco, which is actually kind of the other half of Krakoa. It's very complicated. I don't want to get into it here, but anyway, she plays kind of a starring role in that, and there's some really cool displays of her power in the early parts of that story where she really lets loose and basically is like pulling an entire huge skyscraper out of the sky and really messing stuff up. So and that's just a really cool book in general. It's heavily kind of apocalypse focused, and anything that has to do with apocalypse for me is pretty much my bread and butter. So, but these would both be, this would be a real solid place to start probably, because you get a better sense of the character as she was, and this is where she is, X of Swords. So that's it. That's my thoughts on the character Polaris from X Factor. If I missed anything, please feel free to let me know in the comments. Again, I don't necessarily claim to be an expert on this stuff. I'm mostly just going off my own memory and books that I've read. I remember her featuring in the Inferno event in the X-Men books, and obviously again in X Factor. I know that she had a big part to play in the kind of the galactic saga of Uncanny X-Men that took place not too long ago. I think the War of Kings, a lot of the stuff that was going on with the Shi'ar Empire and Vulcan and all that. She was part of the team that was involved in those events, and you get to see her really kind of let loose in those books as well. So lots of cool. Oh, and then of course, when you paint her, you want to make sure you get her distinctive green hair. That was the one thing that always stood out, was that she had the green hair. But pretty cool character, child of Magneto. Probably not quite as powerful. Magneto is considered to be an Omega level mutant, because of his, and considered to be an Omega level mutant. You have to have like the furthest possible incarnation of your power set, and so naturally, because he is the Omega level magnetism manipulator, he would naturally be more powerful than Polaris, but she's still very, very powerful. And a pretty cool character, and a pretty bold character too, to be, like I said, getting into these questions of kind of mental, fitness, and having a character who's so self-aware of the fact that she's kind of all messed up, is very interesting. So yeah, take a look at some of these books, and keep an eye out for the next installment of Marvel United X-Men Who Dis, where we will be covering another member of X Factor, Strong Guy. And so look forward to that, and I will talk to you later.